first thing to say about PIEs is that the board does think that stakeholders have heightened expectations regarding a firm's independence, and transparency in that context can better inform the views and decisions not only of those charged with governance, but also the wider range of stakeholders that there are in a PIE. In this regard, transparency complements the other revisions to the code's fee-related provisions. Turning to non-PIE audit clients, the board thinks that considering the relatively lower level of public interest, it wouldn't be proportionate to impose the same transparency requirements as in the case of PIEs. Although the requirements for PIEs are new, it's also important to note the extant code already encourages firms to communicate with those charged with governance regarding relationships and other matters that could be relevant to the firm's independence, and clearly that would include fees. Even in the case of PIE audit clients, the board intends the disclosure should only target fee-related information that's necessary to those charged with governance and stakeholders to form their judgments about firms' independence. The board was very sensitive about minimizing any undue burden on firms to collect information purely for disclosure purposes. The main thrust of the provisions of the revised code regarding communication with those charged with governance is to provide a basis for a meaningful two-way discussion rather than a mere statement of the figures. And the board really hopes that the new provisions will stimulate the practice of regular discussions between the firm and those charged with governance about fee-related matters. That in turn will assist those charged with governance in assessing the firm's independence and making informed decisions about fees, not only for audit, but for other services provided by the firm and the network. I think the first thing to recognise is that there may be, and we think rare occasions, that laws and regulations may actually prohibit the client from making fee-related information publicly available for confidentiality reasons. And in that case, the code recognises, as with all other provisions, that national laws and regulation will prevail. In most other cases, the board also acknowledges that it's primarily the client's responsibility to make those fee disclosures. And indeed, that is what the law and regulation in many jurisdictions requires. The changes, therefore, only establish a responsibility for firms when the client doesn't disclose that information. And in that regard, the new set of public disclosure provisions gives due consideration to the primacy of national laws and regulations in guiding that public disclosure. The pronouncement is intended to support this approach by requiring the firm to first communicate with those charged with governance about the benefit of the client's public disclosure to stakeholders. Only after this discussion, if the client still does not make the disclosure, then the firm will have to do so. The board very deliberately provided a very flexible approach for firms to achieve that required transparency. The best way to effect public disclosure does depend on the firm's characteristics and the client's stakeholders. Therefore, we didn't set out to specify exactly how that fee disclosure should be made. And bear in mind, as I said earlier, that fee disclosure by the firm as opposed to the client is expected to be the exception rather than the rule. But the firm should determine what suits its best and its clients, as long as the disclosure is made in a timely and accessible manner to the public stakeholders. We gave some examples in accordance with that approach regarding communication with external parties about the firm's system of quality management in ISQM1, following the IESB's type approach. So transparency report, audit quality report, etc. The board also acknowledged that disclosure in the audit report could be a suitable location, and in that regard, IESBA staff will be issuing non-authoritative guidance to provide more detailed consideration regarding the different avenues of disclosure, including guidance as to which part of the audit report would be an appropriate place for such disclosure, taking into account the input we've received from the IESB.